Hey guys, so this is AP World History, Chapter 29, The Making of Industrial Society. Okay, so this is pretty much all about the development of industry, not only in the US, but also in Great Britain and in Europe primarily, and also the causes and effects of the idea of factories coming in as the predominant form of economic production. So let's go ahead and get started. First, we're going to start with the patterns of industrialization and really how industrialization was able to start. And it starts in Great Britain, and it really starts with coal. So coal will play a major role in Great Britain, and they would substitute coal for wood in the use of energy in their machinery. Coal just lasted longer and was able to get machines that normally would not have been used to come into production. In terms of ecological relief, Great Britain benefited from the Americas because there was a high demand for products. Um, America was kind of the secondary resource that Great Britain had, and they would use it. Some of the primary products that they would bring in from the Americas were sugar and cotton. So these sugar exports helped to pay for the European imports, and the Industrial Revolution, because of this, is going to start in Great Britain. So Great Britain will be the first one to industrialize, the first area to have factories. So we're going to see the mechanization of the cotton industry. This is going to be one of the first types of machinery that people are going to use. It's going to be demand for cotton was high, so that's going to be one of the reasons why they begin to use machines that help to create textiles. So it created machines to speed up the process. Some of the first cotton machines were the flying shuttle, the mule, which was steam powered, one of the first steam powered machines. And weavers couldn't keep up with the production of thread. So what ends up happening is that they begin to create these again machines, and they are begin to be created with water powered looms as well, based off of the steam that the water makes. Is going to help the machine function. So we're going to see this shift from kind of a cottage industry or a proto-industrial industry to a more industrialized economy. So we can't rely on people working at home to do the job anymore. It's the idea that people around the world are asking for large amounts of goods, and it only makes sense to move to machines to produce them at a faster rate. So, like I said, steam power will be one of the main ways that mechanization is able to be put to use. And the steam engine was created by James Watts. So, burn coal to boil water, and then you're going to make the machines work that way. So, by using coal, the heat that it creates, it's going to create the steam, and then the mechanization or the machine is going to work. So, this idea of horsepower comes into play. You might hear that in cars, like 500 horsepower, 200 horsepower. So that means it's the amount of work done by the engine, which is equivalent to the work of the animals. So when they say a car has like 300 horsepower, that means that it would take 300 horses or strong animals of the similar magnitude to move that car. So at a certain rate. So that's where the idea of horsepower comes. Iron and steel. So they begin to use coke, and coke is just a very refined coal. Like you take out all the impurities of coal, and coke is like the pure source of it. So they're going to use coke to produce iron, and iron will become one of the main metals of use, especially in the 18th century, in the 1700s. And the production of it is going to skyrocket. And that's because you got to think of it. They're using it for everything. They're using it to make the machines. They're going to use it in transportation. They're going to use it to make the buildings where the machines are being put in. So the production of it is going to go sky high. Not only that, they're also using it on bridges and ships. So by the 19th century, which is the 1800s, it becomes more about steel. Okay, less about iron and steel. And again, it's just going to be used for the same purposes. It's just stronger, a harder, more resilient metal than iron. We see Henry Bessemer. He's going to create a machine that will make steel stronger, cheaper, and more abundant. And this is also going to help in making it more accessible and more usable to factory owners in particular. And of course, like I said, it's going to replace iron. So 1700s, we see iron, and then 1800s, we see steel. So, in terms of transportation during this industrialization, during these industrial societies, transportation is going to develop, and it's going to develop rapidly. We're going to see steam and metal will create new methods of transportation like steamboats, steamships, as well as the beginning of railroads. So, railroads are going to play a very, very important role, and I'm sorry, not just the railroads, but the trains, the powered locomotives. They're going to play a very important role in getting goods to and from land-based areas. So if we look at America, it's going to be able to connect the western side of America to the eastern side and vice versa through the use of these trains. So during the industrialization period, transportation, like I said, is going to play a major role in helping to develop the industrial industry, in helping to get goods to and from, and not only goods, but people as well. And this is only going to help the economy more. So the next thing we're going to move on to is the factory system. So how were the working conditions if you did work in the factory? So, first of all, the factory, like I told you, it's going to replace the putting out system, which is like the cottage industry that I mentioned, and the proto industrial system. It's going to replace these two because now we're going to have just the factories that you know today. So, by the 18th century, which is the 1700s, most cotton production took place in factories. So, if we're going to make shirts, if we're going to make any sort of textiles, it's going to be done in a factory because we can do it faster in a factory and in a more abundance in a factory. So what ends up happening is most workers were from the countryside. Um, like I said, we have shifted our economy from being an agricultural economy to becoming an industrialized economy by this point. So that means that um, because we are doing that, there's not going to be a need for so many people to work in farms because you're going to see the development of farm machinery that is going to replace that person, which means that that person needs to find a job, and that person will go into the city and begin to work in the factory to find a job. So the reasons that these people were working in the factories was one, because of the countryside, there was no more farming. Also, you had something called enclosure acts, which meant that pretty much they were taking their farmland away to make a factory there. So these people are going to work in the factories and they're going to work for cheap labor. And the reason for that is one, you have a lot of factories by this point. Two, there's rural overpopulation. So meaning that there's an overpopulation of people are coming into the cities. There's a decline in job opportunities. The only job opportunities you're going to find are very low wage, low skilled jobs, which are the factory jobs. And like I said, the other one, these farmers are selling their land, so they'll also come in to work in the factories. And these factories are going to create this new division of labor where one worker equals one task, meaning that if you're going to work in the factory, you're going to do the same job over and over and over and over again every day. And that's it. That's all you do. So it was very, very, very low skilled. You had your managers in the factory who were very forceful and strict work and on strict work and labor, and they were closely supervising the people working there. In terms of working conditions, when you did actually go to your job, so there was going to be better worker productivity, which means there's going to be an increase in the output of goods. The owner class is created by this time, so we're going to see a new social standing with the owner class. You're also going to see industrial owners were mere wage earners and they were also dependent on the low skilled workers. So to an extent they're dependent on these people, but at the same time these people are expendable, which means that they can fire and hire as they please. The idea of artists is pretty much obsolete during this point, during the 17 to 1800s. You don't see a lot of people who are artists and who are selling their art around the streets or anything like that. Clocks and machines and shop rules create a pattern of work. So you're pretty much living your day according to the clock. You're going to wake up at 8 a.m. You're going to go to work at 9. You're going to clock in at 9:10. You're going to work for 12 hours. And there will be a bell to tell you when to take your lunch. So very monotonous routine. And usually you're working 12 to 14 hours daily, 6 days a week. So Monday through Saturday, you're working from, 8 to 8 or 8 to 10. And there was always that pressure that you needed to work faster, you needed to work better, or else they would just fire you and let you go and find somebody else. So, because of this, wanting to work faster, work better, work harder, you're going to see a lot of injuries and a lot of loss of limbs, especially because they would try to fix the machines without stopping them or turning them off, and you would sometimes lose like your thumb or your nail or your finger. Sometimes it was even worse where you would lose a whole body part, or you would sometimes, in the worst case scenarios, you would get killed in the factory because you were trying to fix some sort of machinery. And a lot of times it was little kids who they would put into these places to fix the machinery, since it was in small areas they had to get to. So the working conditions weren't great, and you did see a lot of protests because of this. One of the groups that did this were the Luddites. They destroyed machinery, especially at night, because they didn't want to hurt the people in that were working during the day. And because of this, it was when they would do this, they didn't necessarily think of the repercussions, like you're taking away somebody's job when you break this machine. So they blamed them a lot for unemployment. And like I said, they weren't violent towards people. But once the English government found out who it was, what they were doing, they were pretty much killed. 14 hung as a show of kind of solidarity with the factory owner. So all this is happening in Great Britain at this time, and the industrialization will spread to other parts of Europe, especially into Western Europe. Industrial spread will spread for various reasons, which were more political and economic than anything else. So after Great Britain, we're going to see France, Germany, and Belgium. They'll kind of connect themselves all together in the industrial age. And again, transportation is going to really help speed up this process. And then you're going to see industrialization move into the US. So, in terms of industrialization in North America, we see labor and investment capital comes from Europe. So, a lot of European owners, like wealthy people, they're coming into the United States and they're wanting to start the similar factories that they have over there in their land in Europe. So, they think it's a great opportunity to come over here. So pretty much for the United States, it's going to start in 1820. And like I said, a lot of entrepreneurs are going to come in and start these businesses. 1870s, you're going to see a heavy growth of iron and steel industry, and exactly for the same reasons that you saw it in Europe as well, because of the factory machinery, of building the factories themselves, of the transportation, the steel that's used for the steamboats, the steel that's used for the railroads, the railroad tracks, the trains themselves. So you're going to see that a lot of growth in that. And by 1900, the U.S. will become an economic powerhouse, and industrialization will move into Canada by this time. So, just keep in mind, it doesn't start in the U.S., it starts in Great Britain, will move throughout Western Europe, Germany, France, Belgium, and then it'll come, because of these entrepreneurs, it'll come into North America. So, with this idea of factories and industrialization, we see industrial capitalism develop. So, pretty much the way that these factories are running and the way they make money. So, one of the big ways that they did this was through the idea of mass production. So, an introduction of mass production of various products, just depending on what your little specialty was, what goods you were selling, you can mass produce. Eli Whitney, in order to kind of help factories, he created something called interchangeable parts, a one size fits all model. So let's say you have a cotton machine, a machine that is going to help you to create t-shirts. So instead of having 5 different cotton machines and 5 different parts, if one breaks down, Eli Whitney said, you know what, I'm just going to make one model, and then if anything ever happens, you can use the same parts for any model of cotton machine or whatever. So that really helped in terms of speeding up the process and not having to worry about finding certain parts. We also see in 1913 Henry Ford, he'll introduce the assembly line, And the conveyor will carry components past workers, and that worker has that one job. Like, okay, we're making a car, your job is just to put on the steering wheel. And then we'll move on to the next phase, and then your job is just to, set up the door for the car. So everybody had just one job to do, and this brought in a lot of productivity gains. It really sped things up in terms of creating cars faster or anything faster. So high productivity is going to mean a decline in prices. It's simple economics. If you're producing a lot of goods, that means you're not going to have to pay a lot for them because it's not necessarily like a commodity. And what that means that more people are going to be able to purchase it. So that in the end, that means you're going to be making more money. So it's just simple economics. In terms of big business, you see capitalist businesses develop where you're the entrepreneur, you're making your own money because of the factory that you started. So manufacturers will begin to organize on large scale similar to that of merchants that we saw in, the early 1700s, 1600s, 1500s. In addition, we also see the development of the corporations, monopoly, trusts, and cartels. So the corporations, these were the most common form of business organizations, and corporations controlled mostly all aspects related to industrialization, like the land, the labor, the railroad, the shipping line. So if you're under that one corporation, or then you're going to pretty much control all aspects of it. So a good example would be this picture you see here of like the Standard Oil Company. So they're going to control, where they dig. They're going to buy the land to dig. They're going to, buy the machines to purify the oil, the fossil fuel, and then they're going to have their own stores kind of to sell the oil. So that's the idea of a corporation. You're going to then see the monopolies, trusts, and cartels. So monopolies are that you are pretty much just controlling all areas of one field. So again, a good example would be like you're the only oil company in a certain area, or you're the only electric company in a certain area. That's a monopoly. So that's not legal today. That's actually illegal because it doesn't create competition in the market. So businesses wanted to eliminate competition, and that's why you had the monopoly, which is not, like I said, not legal anymore. You're going to start to restrict markets and create these monopolies. John D. Rockefeller was an example of a monopoly. We also see this idea of vertical organization, which dominates all facets of the industry. Like I told you, so vertical organization, that means that if you are a textile or cloth maker, or your factory makes shirts and different types of clothing, then that means you're going to control all aspects from the land that is going to produce the cotton to the people that are going to sift the cotton to sending the cotton to your factory to the people working the machines in there. So it's vertical. It's going just up and down the control. The other type of monopolies that we see are horizontal organized monopolies, and this consolidates or they cooperate with industrial competition. So again, if this is the cotton industry, again, if we're talking about we're making shirts, then that means that I'm going to be in agreement with somebody who owns the land. They're going to be under me and work for me. And then I'm going to also, be in agreement with somebody who sells my products. They're going to work under me as well. They're independent, but we're working together. So that's a little bit of a difference between vertical and horizontal organization. So you also see the existence of cartels to make gains, and they will begin to fix prices, regulate production, and divide markets, and they will absorb competition through the use of these cartels. And like I said, the government began to react to these monopolies because they saw that they're pretty much controlling everything. They're controlling prices, they're controlling production, they're controlling supply and demand, and they felt that it was not fair to the consumer who was purchasing these goods to not have choices in the goods that they were purchasing. So that's pretty much a little bit about industrialization in terms of the factories, how businesses started, how the corporations, monopolies worked. So now we're going to look at the society itself, the people that came from this, and what was happening because of industrialization. How was society affected because of industrialization? So the first thing we're going to look at is the population growth. So population will grow in the 18th and 19th century. So in the 17 and 1800s, it's going to grow. And it's going to show the prosperity of Europe and the US because of this growth. And there's going to be a rise in the standard of living because of the Industrial Revolution, because more people are making money. That means there's more people who are going to consume goods, meaning they're going to buy stuff. And that's going to raise the standard of living because people are doing better. You're also going to see better medical advances, and vaccines are going to be created during this time. In terms of a demographic transition, fertility is going to decline. People are going to find ways such as birth control to prevent pregnancies. And mortality is going to decline faster than mortality. Mortality is going to decline faster than fertility. So that means that if less people are dying and there's more people, having babies, or the birth rate is increasing faster than the mortality is decreasing, then that means there's going to be a population growth. So the main reason for the declining fertility when it did happen, again, was because of birth control. In the past, there was various methods attempted to prevent births, like cervical caps or drinks, but they found in the 1800s, the first effective method was the male condom. And I believe the first one was made out of like lamb skin or something like that. And that was, not only protecting you from getting pregnant, but also from venereal diseases like syphilis that was pretty popular back then. So popularity grew in the 19th century for birth control when it became the latex condom. So the condom that exists today. In terms of urbanization and migration, with the urban environment, and we're talking about the city. This is, where people were living in the city. So this would be a good example of urbanization. You can see the apartments and the buildings. People are living there. Urbanization led to various environmental effects. Definitely a lot of water and air pollution. They didn't necessarily associate that the smoke that was being put out of these factories was harming the environment. Okay, and a lot of times the water was not the cleanest, so you're going to see a lot of sickness and illness come about. So diseases came based on profession. Cholera, typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis were common. If you were like, a coal worker, you would have, some sort of lung disease because you were working in the coal mines. Even like, a chimney sweeper would also have similar diseases as well, like tuberculosis. So your socioeconomics determined your protection from these environmental factors. Pretty much, if you were wealthy, you're not going to live in the city. You're not going to worry about the smoke. You're not going to worry about the water being bad. You're going to be fine. But if you are living in the city, then these were things that you had to take into consideration in terms of protecting your health. Um, like I said, the wealthy, they're going to live in the suburb homes. And the suburbs are outside of the city. They're not inside the city. They're kind of like outside in nice open land and stuff like that. They're not farming. They're just living outside of the city. So the workers are the ones that are going to live in the city because they have to be close to their jobs in the factories. So by the 19th century, government took control, cleaned water, sewage systems, and building codes. So yeah, by the 1800s, people began to realize, and the government began to realize, like, hey, this is our responsibility to take care of these cities and make sure that they are maintained properly, because the citizens deserve to be taken care of that way. Also, because they didn't want to see a rise in, disease or anything like that. So it became their job, and they took on the job of, taking care of those basic necessities that we use all the time, like the water and the sewage and all that. Transcontinental migration. So because of the Industrial Revolution happening in the United States as well, you're going to see a lot of people come into the U.S. and want to work in these factories. They found that there was a lot of good job opportunity here. And usually the plan was, I'm going to go, I'm going to work, I'm going to make some money, and then I'll go back home into Europe. And what ends up happening is that people stay and they begin to develop their own little towns, like, Chinatown, or a predominantly Italian neighborhood. And it was the largest demographic shift that the US had seen by that time. And migration showed economic, political, and social changes in Europe as well. So sometimes they weren't just leaving for the money. Sometimes they were leaving because of the way the government was functioning in their homeland, and they felt they needed to leave from that. So, just various reasons as to the migration. So, when looking at industrial society, we're going to see new social classes develop. Industry discouraged slave labor. So, slavery, you're going to see an end to it, especially in the northern parts where these factories are at, because they're of no use. Free labor is of no use in a factory. You need people who are getting paid, because that means that those people who are getting paid can purchase goods and consume stuff. So, slavery really didn't help that. Captains of industry and business people become the new wealth. So in the US, it's not about necessarily that you're a king or a queen or you come from nobility. That doesn't exist in the US anymore. And that it's not going to exist necessarily in the other European countries as well. Now, money is going to talk. And if you have it, then you're considered, someone to pay attention to. So then the new middle class will also develop, and the new middle class is going to be small business owners, teachers, physicians, attorneys. That's going to be considered the middle class during this time. And then at the bottom, you're going to have laborers who are the machine workers or the manual laborers as well. So you see this new social class develop where you have the lower class, the middle class, and the wealthy. Industrial families, there was a clear distinction between work and family life. When you're at work, you're working. You go from, whatever time to whatever time. Work was not at home anymore. Work was in a factory. You come home and you're with your family. You're doing family things. Sometimes you would work with your family in a factory, but it wasn't always the case. And family members led more independent lives, and that's because you're kind of going off doing your own thing, working your own hours. So you didn't usually see each other as much. Whereas if you were in a farming family, you would be working together all the time and be relying on each other. Work and play. So men became more important at this time. Self improvement was big, even for leisure. The idea of going to lectures and listening to intellectual thoughts, the idea of reading books. I know, shocking. It was very popular back then. It was the idea that you wanted to make yourself better. So the other thing was that religious institutions helped to reinforce industrial norms. And leisure activities that we would see were European soccer, American baseball, became really popular at this time. You also see the development of gambling. Of course, there's bars, and staged fights also began to come into play. With women at home and at work. So women were unable to work unless they had available care for their children. So unless you had somebody to take care of your child, you're pretty much not necessarily going to work. 19th century did not want them in the factories, and most of the time women were not wanted to work or not in the factories by the factory owners. But if you were really poor, then you had to find a way to support the income that your husband was bringing in. If you were well off, like middle class or like upper middle class or wealthy, you didn't work at all. Like you just stayed home and took care of the kids. So working class women were expected to work until marriage, sometimes after. Most jobs were domestic as middle class and wealthy classes are growing. So like I said, they were just kind of expected to stay at home, especially the middle class women. They did not work outside the home. And it was like you're kind of going to just conform to your traditional role, stay at home, be a good housewife, be a good mother. And at this time, you see women kind of being portrayed as the weaker sex because their lack of work outside of the home. Child labor also existed in the Industrial Revolution. Terrible labor conditions. They worked just as long and as hard as an adult, 12, 14 hours a day, working from dusk till dawn. Sometimes they didn't have any breaks. Sometimes they'd pass out, at their machines. They would suffer beatings if they weren't working fast enough. And so what ends up happening is that the British kind of see what's going on here, and they begin to pass child labor laws, which essentially says, if you're a child, you cannot be working in a factory. That's not your job. Your job is, as a child, is to go to school. And it begins to transfer over into the US. And the US also kind of agrees with that same idea that a child should not be working in a factory. and that they should be going to school. And so you see the beginning of compulsory education around this time. All right, so we're going to move on to the socialism, and this really stems because of the working conditions that these factory workers were facing. So you had utopian socialists. Socialists tried to fix industrial problems. Utopian socialists wanted to create perfect communities that would create equality. The idea that we live in this utopian society and everybody's going to participate and we're all going to be equal, and it was all about love, and it's not about money, and love is going to get us through. And the problem with that is that it is not realistic, and you're going to come into many economic and political problems. So the utopian socialists were not successful. However, because of that, we see these two men, Karl Marx and Frederick Engels, kind of, parlay that idea into their own thoughts. So they were both socialists and said the problems that existed in society were inevitable. Capitalism, they said, divided people into two classes: the capitalists, who were the owners and the means of production, the ones that owned the factories, and the proletariat, which were the people that worked in the factories. And they said that the police and the law, that they're not there to protect the factory workers, they're there to protect the capitalists. So they said police and law support the maintenance of this division. And so what Marx and Engels did is they wrote something called the Communist Manifesto. And what it said in this manifesto was that there should be an abolition of private property. Like, nobody should own private property, is what they're saying. And we should all be equal, is the other argument they made. And that the only way this was going to happen, where we see this equality, is that if the proletariat, which were these wage workers, the factory workers, if they kind of revolt against the capitalists. And they said that if this happens, then the revolution would lead to a fair, just, and egalitarian society. So this Communist Manifesto is going to be kind of the main, you could say, issue, or the main tool that the Russians will use to kind of overthrow their monarchy, and they will begin to form this idea of communism. And China will take hold of this as well later on in the 20th century. All right, so the socialist challenge. Socialists brought about the change and protection of the working class. States became more responsible for the well-being of their citizens. So even though these ideas of socialism didn't work, it did shed a light as to the problems that were there and the problems that needed to be fixed. And so because of this, the state, like it says, will become more responsible for the well-being of their citizens. Other reform programs will develop, like the retirement pension. You're going to see minimum wage, insurances and regulation of hours. And then we're also going to see the creation of trade unions. So unions were like these groups that were going to be working in favor of the factory workers. So unions sought to better wages and working conditions for their members, and it would gradually improve their lives despite the occasional protest. But it did not seek to destroy capitalism, but make employees more responsible. So these trade unions were there to kind of support, again, the factory owners and make sure they were not being taken advantage of. All right, so lastly, we're going to look at the effects of industrialization on a global level. There's going to be an international division of labor. So the military will rely on industry for their weaponry, and there's going to be a need for minerals, agriculture, raw materials. And this is going to come from usually Africa for the most part, the demand for raw materials because of these new technologies. So you're going to see that these raw materials are going to be coming from Africa and other parts of the world, and which is going to lead to economic development, but not economic development for everybody. So various lands saw economic growth as they were the exporters of primary goods. Economic development happened two ways. So either you're going to do it flourishing markets and entrepreneurs counteracting high wages with new labor-saving technologies. Okay? So pretty much either you're going to be making money because of your factory, or you're going to be making money because of the raw materials produced. But all in all, it's going to create, most importantly, economic interdependence. Some of the countries did not benefit from the Industrial Revolution, and some were simple areas for cash crops. And industrialization is going to roll over into this idea of imperialism, which we will look at in later chapters. All right, so that's pretty much the Revolution. Make sure you understand the causes of it, the effects of it, what's happening, the context of what's happening during this time that's leading to this industrialization.